It can be hard to imagine the kind of existential fear that permeated everyday life during the Cold War without actually having lived through it. From the end of World War II to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, the threat of the entire planet being annihilated in a global thermonuclear war was an ever-present background noise for everyone on Earth. And in October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis saw the world come closer to ending than it ever had before. For about a week, millions of people believed that they were about to be wiped out at any moment and prepared for the worst. And then, the world didn't end. The United States and the Soviet Union reached an agreement and stood down their arsenals, for now. And all those people who had believed just hours ago that they were going to die were now expected to simply go back to living their lives like nothing had happened. How do you even begin to react to a collective trauma like that? What's the correct response to having come so close to everything you know and love being destroyed, and all because of the machinations of your own government? What do you do? Well, sometimes all you can do is laugh.
Sir, I have a plan. Monsieur! I can walk!
In the early 1960s, director Stanley Kubrick bought the film rights to the thriller novel Red Alert. He told his friends how impressed he was by the level of detail used to outline how easily a devastating nuclear war could happen through dangerous loopholes in American military protocols. The possibility of war breaking out had been on Kubrick's mind more and more as the Cold War escalated throughout the 1950s, culminating in the aforementioned missile crisis, and he initially started writing the screenplay intending to preserve the tone of Red Alert, that of a very tense, very serious warning about humanity's impending destruction. But Kubrick soon hit a wall when he attempted to adapt the story this way. In his own words, "I found that in trying to put meat on the bones and to imagine the scenes fully, one had to keep leaving out of it things which were either absurd or paradoxical in order to keep it from being funny, and these things seemed to be close to the heart of the scenes in question." And so he decided to drastically change his approach. The plot of Dr. Strangelove still does remain broadly the same as Red Alert. An American Air Force general, driven mad by anti-communist paranoia, orders the use of Plan R to send bombers loaded with nuclear weapons to attack the Soviet Union, despite them not having attacked the United States first. The American government scrambles to stop the bombers, eventually managing to obtain the recall code and bring them back, except for one whose radio equipment has been damaged. Aside from all the jokes and the much goofier tone, this is where the book differs most strongly from the film. In Red Alert, the last plane fails to destroy its target anyway and a global catastrophe is averted. In Strangelove, well... Kubrick saw the inherent absurdity at the heart of Red Alert's premise, and by extension, the entire Cold War. He saw just how plain funny it was that a single general having a bad day could, through the lax protocols of one of the most powerful nations on Earth and the bumbling incompetence of its politicians, bring about the total annihilation of human society. And these days, most people would agree with him. Strangelove is considered by many to be one of the best comedy films of all time and manages to rank very highly in Kubrick's almost universally outstanding body of work. But at the time of its release in 1964, critical reaction was a lot more mixed. Bosley Crowther called it the most shattering sick joke I've ever come across, and Columbia, who had financed the film, worried that it was too anti-American and anti-military. Despite this, it still did well at the box office, and by 1989, any negative opinions had died down enough for it to be one of the first films chosen for preservation by the Library of Congress. But I still find it interesting to think about why its initial reception was so polarised. Were large chunks of the American public simply not in the mood to joke about nuclear war just 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis? Not to mention that Kennedy had just been assassinated 2 months prior. Or would the hard truths that Strangelove dishes out have been hard to swallow at any time, regardless of the immediate cultural climate? Would this kind of movie, about a crisis that is at the forefront of everyone's mind, perform well critically and commercially now? Well, Adam McKee and Netflix sure thought so.
I think this whole administration has completely lost their fucking mind! And I think we're all gonna die!
Now, I said it might be hard to imagine how terrifying it was to live through the Cold War and the constant threat of mass extinction, which may not be entirely true. I was only born in... so I can't say for certain. But if I had been alive for the real peaks of the Cold War, the 1 minute to midnight moments, I imagine it would have felt something like what living through the climate crisis feels like. Don't Look Up, released at the tail end of last year, is also a satire about the end of the world, using its plot, that of an asteroid about to strike Earth, as a metaphorical basis to criticise the American government's response to climate change, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. Just like Dr. Strangelove, it ends in total disaster, with the entire world wiped out by the asteroid thanks to the incompetence, insanity, and greed of those in power. It's obviously a lot harder to track exactly how well Don't Look Up has done commercially, considering that Netflix doesn't release data on how well their stuff does, and when they do release something, it's a little exaggerated. But critically, it has also attracted somewhat of a divisive response. Its fans are talking about how important and vital it is that it manages to perfectly skewer its subjects and speak truth to power while raising more awareness about impending ecological collapse. Its critics are saying that it's only made for people who already agree that something should be done about the causes and consequences of climate change and isn't going to change the minds of any skeptics, rendering it something of a self-aggrandizing echo chamber. Including this handsome intellectual who fired off this tweet mere seconds after having watched it, which is the best and only way to critique art, of course. But when I actually took the time to reflect a little more on the film, I had a thought, which is rare for me and therefore worth documenting. Does satire need to change minds? Does any comedy movie need to have a purpose beyond being funny? Or can it just make people laugh for the sake of making them laugh? And how do Dr. Strangelove and Don't Look Up align and differ in their approaches to joking about something that shouldn't really be funny at all? Well, keep your heads down, don't look at the big board, and strap in for the apocalypse, because today we're going to compare and contrast Adam McKee's Don't Look Up and Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Where did all the movies with 13-word titles go, Hollywood, you cowards? Both of these movies are quite pessimistic in their presentation, or at least they certainly seem to be at first glance. Their endings show the few characters who might be able to stop their respective catastrophes failing miserably and everyone dying horribly while a dissonantly cheery song plays over the credits. But where Don't Look Up and Strangelove differ is in how much fun they are having with their dark conclusions and everything that comes before it. Strangelove, as expected from Kubrick's changes to the book, revels in the absurdity of its plot and characters. The cast are mostly comprised of over-the-top caricatures with nothing else underlining them, nothing to make the audience reconsider their initial impressions of them. The insane general, the mad scientist, the other insane general. What you see is what you get. That's not a criticism, by the way. Uncomplicated characters aren't necessarily bad characters. In fact, the simplicity of Strangelove's roster of idiots and lunatics is part of exactly what satire is meant to do. Exaggerate people and situations as much as possible in order to point out the ridiculousness that was there all along. And what's most surprising here would be just how close to the real thing Strangelove is even with this exaggeration. The Air Force actually had to change their nuclear strike protocols after the film was released, quietly admitting that it had been entirely possible for things to pan out this way in real life. Don't Look Up, meanwhile, is a lot more grounded, even though its events are more improbable. The odds of any passing asteroid hitting Earth are usually around a few million to one. Its characters are also more complex than in Strangelove, and even the most self-serving examples, the ones who plunge the Earth further and further into danger, are clearly capable of some level of critical thought. Stupidity is still the main hindrance to the more reasonable characters preventing the apocalypse, but it's more of a how can I profit from this stupidity and less a no fighting in the war room stupidity. Strangelove does have some characters that seem to have more than one brain cell, namely Captain Lionel Mandrake and President Merkin Muffley, but Mandrake is still played for laughs being a stuffy English officer type who is simply too polite to put a stop to Ripper's plan any earlier, and Muffley also lacks a certain level of self-awareness. He's the one who delivers that war room line, after all. Even these more sensible characters still feel like characters. Again, not a bad thing at all. Both of Merkin Muffley's names meaning pubic wig is cinema, actually. To go back to Don't Look Up, its characters do by and large feel like real people, which adds to the palpable sense of frustration felt throughout. Strangelove's characters can't find their noses with both hands and were clearly doomed from the start. But the president in Don't Look Up was so close to actually doing something. Leo and Jennifer were within touching distance of saving the entire world until it was ripped away from them by a greedy billionaire who shows himself as the real power in the White House. You can feel how angry Adam McKee was while writing this, to the point where the movie shifts into being a straight drama sometimes. That downer ending is played entirely seriously and doesn't shy away from showing the mass tragedy of humanity's final extinction. Again, we can compare this with... And I don't know how controversial this take is going to be, but I am nothing if not a silly little boy that loves saying dumb things on the internet, so here goes. I think that this difference in tonal approach is exactly why Strangelove works for me and Don't Look Up kind of doesn't. Don't get me wrong, I wouldn't even say that I disliked Don't Look Up, really. There's a lot of things to compliment it for. It's got quite a few genuinely funny moments, mostly from Jonah Hill and Mark Rylance's characters, the soundtrack is great, and, as I said, the movie does capture the sheer frustration that comes from elected officials being selfish and greedy in plain sight, only to face absolutely zero consequences for it. Or rather, make us all face the consequences of it. But for lack of a better word, Don't Look Up just isn't zany enough. Strangelove begins with an insane general ordering an attack on the Soviet Union, and the movie keeps it going at 100 miles an hour for the next 90 minutes, relentlessly throwing absurd characters, lines, and situations at you one after the other. Don't Look Up begins with Jennifer Lawrence finding a comet, and then her and Leo meandering about the White House, and then hopping onto a daytime talk show for a little bit before the plot finally kicks in. And I get that Don't Look Up is trying to make a point about the apathy surrounding government and media responses to an impending climate disaster, but there are better ways to show this than dragging out the plot for much longer than needed. Another hot take incoming: no movie claiming to be a comedy should be 2.5 hours long, and this absurd runtime I think really helps to cut to the heart of my main issue with this movie. Don't Look Up can't decide whether it wants to be a comedy or not. It's like Adam McKee's early career is fighting with his career now. The movie wants to be a broad satirical take on modern America and the media and the climate crisis, while also being a hard-hitting drama that stirs people's souls and makes them rise up to take action. And look, I'm not saying that a satire can't take a moment to get serious. Other satirical comedies like Sorry to Bother You or Jojo Rabbit do have serious moments to underline how messed up the things they're joking about really are. But these are used sparingly and more often than not get slowly more intense as the film reaches its climax, instead of being peppered throughout. Every time a scene begins in Don't Look Up, you have no idea whether it's going to be taking itself seriously or not. Is this a scene from a Best Picture nominee or a Best Musical or Comedy nominee? Does Adam McKee know? Should I know? Okay, I'm maybe getting a little off topic here, and I want to reiterate that I did ultimately like the movie. With that said, I still think Strangelove has a much better approach in tackling what it wants to satirize, and that Don't Look Up in many ways comes off as an inferior version of it. But I want to circle back to a question that I asked at the beginning of the video, and the one I put in the title, funnily enough. Does satire, and for that matter comedy as a whole, need to justify its existence to be worthwhile? What's the point of all this anyway? So there's really no way to go about this without sounding at least a little bit pretentious, but I think we need to define exactly what satire is before we can decide whether it, and by extension these two films, has or needs a point. I already gave a brief definition of what I think a good satire should do. Exaggerate people and situations as much as possible in order to point out the underlying absurdity of the values and perspectives underlying them. But I think we can get a little bit more specific than that. In a 1970 article about Dr. Strangelove, American critic Robert Brustein referred to the film as a Juvenalian satire. But this isn't just a more pretentious way to call something childish. It actually refers to 3 categories that satirical works can, in theory, be sorted into: Juvenalian, Horatian, and Menippean. Juvenalian and Horatian are named for 2 ancient Greek satirists, while Menippean comes from ancient Rome. Let's start with the Greeks. Juvenalian and Horatian satires mainly differ in how they choose to present the subjects of their mockery. Horatian works are usually a lot kinder, lightly poking fun at powerful people and organisations while never straying too far into direct criticism. Juvenalian satires are the exact opposite, offering no holds barred takedowns of whatever they've set their sights on, and coming from a much angrier, more directly critical place. For Juvenalian works, those in power aren't just silly, bumbling incompetents, they're actively malicious. Separated from these is Menippean, which will often take on prevailing ideas or moods in society rather than hitting out at individuals. A Menippean satire might criticise the greed brought about by capitalism, for example, but it's unlikely that it will have a direct caricature of Elon Musk or JP Morgan Chase. So of these 3 categories, which do Strangelove and Don't Look Up fit into? Okay, I'll be honest. When I first researched kinds of satire, I thought that sorting these movies into one of them would be much easier. Maybe I'm just stupid, and I'm definitely not ruling that out, but it seems to me that both movies display aspects of Horatian and Juvenalian satire. But both of them do depict actual entities and, in some cases, fictionalizations of actual people, so I'm pretty sure we can rule out Manipian. So, let's talk about their Horatian sides first, starting with Strangelove. As I said previously, most of the characters in Strangelove are just idiots instead of actively malicious, with the prominent exception of General Ripper. In fact, the president in this movie doesn't really do anything wrong when reacting to the situation he's presented with. He listens to his advisors, he immediately attempts to get the cooperation of the Soviets, and he only fails to prevent disaster because of dumb luck. The last bomber has their communication systems damaged and is unable to receive the recall order they sent out. He also doesn't seem to be a gotcha caricature of any particular American president. Certainly not Kennedy, who was president when the film was being written and filmed, or Lyndon Johnson, who was president by the time it was released. Peter Sellers did partly base his performance on Adlai Stevenson, a former governor of Illinois who had tried and failed to become president 3 times, but the character as written is still a fairly standard, level-headed leader archetype, and there are no jokes made at Stevenson's expense. At least, not any that I, a non-American from 60 years later, picked up on. Ultimately, Strangelove criticises the absurdity of nuclear war, of 2 countries relying on the constant tension brought about by the possibility of nuclear war in order to avoid it, but it doesn't actually criticise the United States as a country or its flawed systems of government or any aspects of its foreign policy that have driven the world so close to the brink of war in the first place. The most it does is point out some exploitable loopholes in Air Force protocol and maybe highlight flaws in the military's hiring practices. Despite Columbia's anxieties, Strangelove doesn't come across as particularly anti-military at all. It's more, the military would be fine if it wasn't currently staffed by morons. Remember that the man who comes the closest to averting the disaster is also in the military, albeit the British military. This is because it's the far superior military, God save the... Now, this is all very interesting to me because a common criticism I've seen levelled at Don't Look Up is that it does point the finger at self-serving rich people, the group in society who deserve most, if not all, of the blame for the current climate crisis, but it only does this on a surface level. But Strangelove, which on the surface may look more subversive and anti-establishment, doesn't really rock the boat that much either, at least by 2022 standards. Does this make it a purely Horatian satire? No, because then the video would be over. So why don't we table this for now and see how well Don't Look Up fits into being Horatian. Now, as many of you might have expected from the description of Horatian satire I gave, Don't Look Up does display a lot of attributes of that category. At times. The vapidness of most celebrity-driven activism is given a light touch, even coming complete with a catchy pop song from Ariana Grande partway through. And yes, the film has the same issue as Dr. Strangelove, where it criticises the people currently holding the reins of the United States government, but not how those centuries-old institutions have brought us to the brink of disaster. It makes fun of milquetoast celebrity activism while itself being full of celebrities participating in that exact brand of activism. Some people might argue that it is self-aware about this. I would disagree and add that even if it is self-aware about what it is, that doesn't suddenly make it not that. I would also like to take this moment to highlight that Leonardo DiCaprio, our environmental poster boy and star of this movie, frequently takes holidays on a super yacht that produces more CO2 emissions in 7 miles than one car produces in an entire year. Cheers mate, see you on the spaceship. With all that said, there are moments where Don't Look Up becomes purely Juvenalian, the most prominent being when DiCaprio's character finally loses his patience with the news media's refusal to focus on actually important things and blows up on live television, screaming about how they're all going to die and yet nobody who could stop it seems to care. There is no sugarcoating to his rant, and because he's on live TV, it's directed right at the cameras and therefore right at us, punching through the fourth wall to beg everyone with power in the real world to pull their heads out of their asses before it's too late. It's practically Brechtian. Did I use that right? Oh, in my very humble opinion, it's a genuinely great moment, and although Leo's character arc over the movie could have been a lot better, I think this scene serves as a decent conclusion to it. Like I said earlier, one thing McKee does really well is capture the frustration of no one in power caring about the climate crisis enough to take meaningful action on it. And I hear you asking, what about Dr. Strangelove's Juvenalian side? Well, you don't actually need to look much further than its title character. Dr. Strangelove himself is explicitly based on several real people, the most prominent being Werner von Braun, a Nazi rocket scientist who was secretly moved to the United States after World War II and set up at NASA, where he helped advance the American space program during the 1960s. And, would you believe it, Strangelove's most prominent running joke is that he is quite clearly a former Nazi with a phantom hand which keeps saluting at every available opportunity. Strangelove also mentions his association with the Bland Corporation in the film, an obvious parody of the real-life think tank the Rand Corporation. Herman Kahn, another inspiration for Strangelove, was one of Rand's top military strategists and helped develop the policy of mutually assured destruction. Basically, from an American perspective, the Soviet Union needs to believe that even if they struck first in a nuclear war, the USA would still have enough capability left to destroy them too in a second retaliating strike. This, allegedly, will avert nuclear war altogether. Even at the time, a lot of people realised how ridiculous this policy was, as well as being a good excuse for arms companies to profit off of manufacturing more weapons for the government, and we see this reflected in every recommendation that Strangelove makes to the War Room Committee, culminating in his farcical outlining of how humanity could survive underground in mine shafts for the next 100 years until the nuclear fallout wears off. Kahn also contributed to this line of thinking in real life. Survivability, it was called. Aside from Strangelove, both Generals Ripper and Turgidson also take inspiration from a real-life person. The then current Air Force Chief of Staff, Curtis LeMay, who was a fan of, to use a technical term, bombing the living hell out of his problems. He did this to Japan in World War II, and did his best to get the Air Force to do it to Cuba during the missile crisis, and just for the hat trick, he tried to do it again during the Vietnam War. With this interesting context, it's pretty easy to see how Kubrick is using Ripper and Turgidson to make fun of LeMay's views on foreign policy. Ripper even directly paraphrases something that Curtis LeMay said during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Mandrake, do you recall what Clemenceau once said about war? He said war was too important to be left to the generals. When he said that, 50 years ago, he might have been right. But today, war is too important to be left to politicians.
Compare this with LeMay once saying they did not understand what had been created and handed to them, to express his deep frustration at the Kennedy administration's reluctance to, nuke Cuba. Just one more thing that Strangelove is under-exaggerating, really. So, how does this get us any closer to answering the title of the video? Do both of these movies, by virtue of their moments of pointed criticism, qualify as Juvenalian anyway, as important vehicles for change, representing brave stands against nuclear war and climate denial respectively? Or are they just empty Horatian performance pieces that do little more than lightly rib the powerful without being truly subversive or earth-shaking? Well, let's see if we can finally answer our question by moving back into the modern day. Back in 2015, in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo killings, author Will Self wrote an article for the BBC entitled "What's the Point of Satire?" He touches on a lot of different perspectives, including what he sees as the differing moods in British and French satire. But I want to pick out just one quote from him to examine. "My personal yardstick for whether or not something qualifies to be satire at all is thus an adaptation of a classic definition of what constitutes good journalism. Such an enterprise, it was written, should comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Whenever I'm presented with a cartoon, a piece of writing, or a comic shtick purporting to be satiric, I always interrogate it along these lines. Who does it afflict, and who does it comfort? If in either case the work is mistargeted, so afflicting the already afflicted, or comforting those already well upholstered, it fails the test, and will need to be reclassified, usually as merely offensive, or egregiously offensive." These criteria, while not too far off the comparisons between Horatian and Juvenalian satire we've already applied here, are far stricter, and, in my opinion, do finally offer some separation between these two films. Because while Strangelove could be accused of not really challenging existing power structure beyond a surface level, it's hardly comforting to the politicians and military leaders it's depicting either. Nor does it afflict the afflicted, i.e. lay the blame at the feet of ordinary people. In fact, the only person we see in the film who isn't a government or military figure is Turgidson's secretary. You could maybe argue that the bomber crew qualify as ordinary people, being far less high-ranking than the generals we see otherwise, but even their scenes feel like a criticism of the consequences of soldiers blindly following orders, rather than an attempt to punch down at anyone. Don't Look Up, unfortunately, doesn't breeze past this test so easily. Throughout the film, a certain emphasis is placed on how the masses have all been brainwashed by the media and, apart from the few heroic middle-class scientists, are too stupid to save themselves. There's even a part of the movie where the president and her staff are telling crowds of working-class people, some in suspiciously familiar red hats, to avoid looking at the comet. To not look up?
Oh wait, that's not...
The people in these crowds are shown as straight-up idiots who believe the president's lies without any deeper exploration as to why they might be so willing to jump on board with this ludicrous conspiracy theory. For my money, it smacks a little too much of the smug centrist takes you see on why Trump won in 2016. His working class supporters supported him because, well, they're just dumb and racist for no reason. Classism, I barely know her. And that is not me trying to make excuses for any current or ex-Trump supporter. Being misinformed does not absolve you of the consequences of your actions. I only want to point out that Don't Look Up had a great opportunity to use its story to explore what led to a lot of the white working class voting for Trump, but instead it decided to make a cheap, sneering joke at the expense of a group that have contributed to the climate crisis far less than any one of the people on this movie's poster. So, by Will Self's definition, all of that would make Don't Look Up pointless and Strangelove full. At least by my interpretation of his definition. Because this is all subjective, of course. If someone watches a film and forgets about it instantly, but someone else carries the morals it imparted with them for the rest of their life, doesn't that make the film not completely pointless? Of course, then you have to add the caveat that just because a film has a moral doesn't necessarily mean it's a good moral, and that someone can get the complete wrong end of the stick from something anyway and start a fight club in their basement, and I could be here all day talking about this. But would you look at that, we still haven't answered the question in the title of the video. Maybe this video was the thing that doesn't have a point after all, wouldn't that be a twist? So to recap, Dr. Strangelove maybe has a point, and Don't Look Up maybe doesn't. Okay, sure. But finally, oh god, finally, let's answer the question, does that even matter? So the quickest path to our final answer here is to examine whether the creators of these works set out to effect societal change through their art in the first place. Well, Kubrick almost certainly didn't. He wanted to make a thriller about nuclear war, and when he saw how absurd it all was, shifted it into a comedy. At the end of the day, he just thought it would make a good joke. As mentioned, Strangelove did end up changing American nuclear war policy, but it never set out to do that. Now, even with all we know about the production of this movie, beyond a certain point you can only guess at the intent of someone who's been dead for 23 years. It's also worth noting that Kubrick was far from the only creative mind behind the script. He was co-written with Terry Southern and Peter George, the man who wrote Red Alert, which possibly muddles the waters even further as far as intent goes. Adam McKee, meanwhile, has a Twitter account, God help him. And it's quite clear from scrolling through it for just a few minutes that he wants Don't Look Up to play some part in the ongoing climate action movement. He's retweeted a few Extinction Rebellion posts, quote tweeted other posts talking about the science of the climate crisis, all while hashtagging them with Don't Look Up. Plus, using film to push forward a specific political agenda is pretty par for the course with McKee now. He's moved from making silly, broad comedies like Step Brothers and Anchorman to more serious fare like The Big Short and Vice in recent years, definitely making an effort to centre himself as a social issue director while still trying to keep his work relatively comedic. And, again, whether you think Don't Look Up will genuinely affect change is entirely subjective, and also too early to tell considering it's only been out for less than 2 months. What matters is that McKee wants it to do that. Or it might matter. Maybe. I promise I'm getting to the end here, just stick with me. Kubrick likely didn't care whether his movie had a political impact on the world, and McKee definitely does. That has to count for something, doesn't it? Okay, that's it. Enough time wasting. You clicked on this video with the promise of actually getting an answer to whether or not satire needs a point, to whether either of these movies need to justify their own existence, and I think I can finally give you a solid answer. Royalty-free drumroll, please. Yeah, I've got no idea. I mean, I really screwed up when I attempted to tackle a question like that in one YouTube video. I'm sorry, you can collect your refunds at the door. Because to ask, does satire need a purpose, is to ask whether comedy needs a purpose, whether art itself needs a purpose. What's the point of anything? Where the hell did I put my keys? Oh, they're here. But even if we can't get a concrete answer to the question we set out with, it's still been fascinating for me to compare these two movies. I came in with very preconceived notions about them, and I'm walking away with those views kind of turned on their heads. Critically, my opinions on these films remain much the same. I think that Strangelove deserves its place as one of the greatest satires ever put to film, and I think that Don't Look Up is fine. But examining the ways they choose to point and laugh at their subjects, when they think it's right to prod at a specific target and when they decide to widen their scope in order to criticise society as a whole, I don't know, I still had a lot of fun drilling down to find out why they do what they do and what it can teach us about one of the most interesting subgenres out there, in my opinion. I hope you got something out of it too. And I just want to end with this, and I know it might sound a bit overly romantic, but for what it's worth, I think a film matters as much as you think it does, whether that's in a good or a bad way. Someone will watch a movie satirising the climate crisis and forget about it 20 minutes after the credits, and someone else will watch it and genuinely be stirred into action to effect positive change, to really change life for the better, and that has to mean something, doesn't it?